Yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As you can see on the screen, especially if there is a fictional language. Now, before moving on to the study, first of all, I would like to talk about the novel, which was written by Anthony Burgess in 1962. Now, this is considered one of the famous novels of the author, and it was first published in 1962. And it is set in the future, but unlike the other utopic works, this is a dystopian world described by the author. And again, I would like to mention that the book is not set in a specific time, but it surely reflects a future world. Now, as we all know, the opposite of utopias, in other words, ideal societies, dystopias reflect severely malfunctioning societies, which is the exact condition actually in Anthony Burgess's novel. Now, as we mentioned in our research questions, there is a fictional language in this novel called Natsat. And secondly, I would like to talk about the translation of the novel by Aziz Üstel. Now, the book originally has two translations. The first translation was done by Aziz Üstel in 1973, and the second translation of this novel was done by Dost Körpe in 2003. And I will be analyzing the first version of the novel in this study. And as we have mentioned before, we will be analyzing the book in terms of equivalence approaches, and as I mentioned before, which is one of the main interests of the theorists in the field of translation study, we will analyze the novel in terms of equivalence approaches in translation. Now, especially in terms of literature translation, the most important feature is actually aesthetic function. Now, the aesthetic image obtained in the translation version of the novel should be equivalent to the original one. So what we are looking for at this point is finding the right equivalence between the source and target works. In this sense, the novel of Anthony Burgess called A Clockwork Orange consists of a great amount of aesthetic images, including its fictional language. So what we are looking for here at this point is equivalence, a balance between the source and the target text. And it should render the key elements of the novel and not Natsat itself. And in this sense, the best possible way to translate a fictional language, which I will be talking about now, would be using an approach based on equivalence. Now, in order to perceive the study, first we need to understand what is this fictional language used in the novel. Now, I will be referring to this fictional language as Natsat. And as I mentioned before, this is a dystopian language created by the author of the novel. So it consists of several items, and it is the fictional language used by the main character and his friends. And it should also be noted that this is not just a social act made of foreign words, but it is again can be considered as a linguistically constructed language. And in this sense, since this is a constructed language, it's not an original or it's not a standardized language, the complexity of the translation multiplies, since the translator has to deal with a linguistically constructed language. Now, when we analyze the elements of this language, it includes, first of all, Russian loanwords. So we will be seeing words which are borrowed from the Russian language. We also have invented and modified words, and these words are again created by the author. We also have Cockney rhyming slime, which I will be explaining in the following slides. And we also have schoolboy transformations, which can be considered like a child speech. Now, rendering these, reflecting these fictional modified transformations in the target text actually is the most important point, because we want the same effect which is created on the source audience to be created on the target audience as well. And at this point, equivalence approaches gains a great importance. Okay. Now, we will be analyzing these aspects one by one, and we will be looking at the examples, okay, taken from the novel. Now, the first section is Russian loanwords, and as I mentioned before, this fictional language called Natsat includes words which are taken, which are borrowed from the Russian language. So at this point, the translator has to first find the Russian equivalent of the words, translate them into English, and then translate them into Turkish language. And in order to create the same effect, the perfect scenario will be actually using the same Russian words. But let's see what did the translator do here. Let's look at the first example. The word that we are analyzing at this point is zubis, which means teeth actually, and it is generated from Russian language. And when the Turkish language and the Turkish slang languages are taken into consideration, there is no equivalent word to reflect such an invented word, because the word does not exist both in English and Turkish languages. Now, at this point, the approach of the translator, Aziz Üstel, was conveying the meaning at a word level rather than reflecting the style of the author. Let's look at the example. The first example states that false zubis, as you can see, zubi means teeth in Russian, and the translator used the exact equivalent word, but in Turkish, and used yalancı dişleri in order to reflect the message of the author. Let's look at the second example now. Now here, the word drug, which is really frequently used in the source text, means friend in English. And when we look at the translation of friend, it is observed that despite being different words, they are interchangeable. Textual equivalence is achieved at this point. So, oops. Yes. So the word druk is translated again as kardeşlerim in the target text. So at this point, Üstel conveyed a textual equivalence in terms of when we think about the text itself. And the third example includes the word devochka, which means girl in the target language. And again, using an equivalence-based approach, here Üstel again didn't use a let's say created or modified word, but at the second scenario, the author preferred to use the slang equivalent of the term. Now, apart from the Russian loanwords, the language that we call Natsat also includes invented or, in other words, modified words. Now, when we compare the translation process of these invented or modified words, we can say that it is easier than the translation of Russian words, since the equivalents of these terms are available in the target language. Now let's look at the translation. The first example includes a term which is called staja, and here staja is the combination of the first syllables of state, jail, and it is used as a staja. And when we look at the translated text, the target text, Üstel here used the same style of the author, and he modified the words devlet tutukevi as devtut. Now here, textual equivalence is maintained, since the technique of the author and the translator is the same. And in this case, Üstel used a technique which made the style of the author possible to sense by the target reader, since he was able to maintain the textual equivalence. Okay, now I will be moving on. With the Cockney rhyming slang. First, in order to understand the technique which is used by the translator here, first we need to know what is Cockney rhyming slang, and then we will be moving on to the examples. Now we can define Cockney rhyming slang is an artistic device which actually creates a nonsense around a lexical item in a similar way. And again, it is another linguistic variety that Burgess used under the framework of this fictional language called Natsat. And Cockney rhyming slang is actually a funny slang first used by the Cockneys in the east of the London. And again, it is now understood widely throughout London and in actually all Britain. So it is a commonly used some kind of slang language. Now, let's look at the example. The words that we are looking at this point is, in the first example, pretty Polly, and the target version, source version, hışır hışır eden bozuk para. Now, what did the translator do here? In this example, the translator preferred to use qualifiers in order to convey the same message, the theme, to the audience. But unfortunately, here, the loss of translation is observed, since the translator was not able to use a rhyming slang word which is equivalent with poly due to the structural differences between the source and the target language. And this loss was actually expected, again, due to the structural and cultural differences between the source and target languages. Okay, when we look at the second example, it is observed that the word Charlie here is derived from the name Charlie Chaplin, and the author was trying to reflect the concept Chaplain here, and it is, as you can see, translated as Rahip Efendi. Now here, the translator's usage of different words in the process of translating cogni-rhyming slime stems from nil equivalence typology. And what is nil equivalence typology? It is when there is no target language expression exist for a target language expression. Now, all in all, when you want to summarize this chapter, above given examples, the rhyming slang called cogni effect is lost. But when the target culture is taken into consideration, the exact translation of these phrases is nearly impossible, since as I mentioned before, because these are all culture-specific items. They exist in the culture of the source language, and since we do not have any exact rhyming slime in the Turkish language, nil equivalence typology comes into existence in this point, so we cannot find no target language expression for a source language expression. Yes, the final component of NatSat is produced by, it can be considered as a child speech, which gives the impression of a relatively younger person. Now, in all of these examples, let's look at the examples first. For example, badiwats, which means kötü, bad, at this point, is translated as kötü. Egivex, which is used to reflect the term eggs, is translated as yumurta. And in the final example, skolivol, which is used to reflect the term school, is translated as, again, okul. Now, in all of these examples, Üstel translated the child talk without creating the same expression. At this point, Üstel's choice of translation is not faithful to the author's intention, because with using these schoolboy transformation, the author aimed to actually soften the profile of NatSat users. However, since the grammatical and stylistic patterns of both languages, Turkish and English, are not similar, it is very hard for the translator to create the exact equivalence of these childish words. Okay, now I will be moving on with the conclusion. Now, before moving on to the conclusion, I want to look at this statement, which is taken from the author itself, and he states that as the book was about brainwashing, it was appropriate that the text itself should be a brainwashing device. The reader should be brainwashed to learn minimal Russian, which is true. When you first started to read the book, there is a need to check the glossary in every 5 or 6 sentences. But as you move on, you get used to these usage of Russian and Cockney rhyming slime and schoolboy transformation. So you are brainwashed to understand NatSat language itself. And again, the topic of the book is again brainwashing. And the author states that since the topic of the novel is brainwashing, the reader should also be brainwashed to understand minimal Russian. So let's jump back to the research question. The first research question about of this study was about the reflection of the original essence to the translation. And when handling literature translation, reflecting the original essence and the aesthetic features to the translation, as we have talked before, is one of the most important factors. The matter that should be taken into consideration at this point is the motive of the author in the process of constituting the novel. As mentioned in the previous chapter, the fictional language that Burgess created consists of, as we have talked before, many loan words borrowed from the Russian language, and from the statement that you can see on the slide, actually is not perceived in the translated version. And moreover, in addition, Burgess also notes that the novel was to be an exercise in linguistic this is really interesting, linguistic programming. With the used words, a glossary would disturb the programming. That's why he aimed to brainwash the reader. And as a matter of fact, throughout the end of first chapter, it becomes very easy to perceive the language created by Burgess, and the readers are eventually adjust the language as they are slowly initiated in the chaotic world that Burgess creates. However, the situation when we handle the target language, target text, the translated version does not have a fictional language which is similar to the original, and the author's motive here, while writing the novel, does not apply to the Turkish translation of the novel. And on the other hand, Üstel's usage of Turkish slang words achieved to reflect the chaotic world that the author of the novel tried to create. Now, if you want to summarize it, we've talked about equivalence in translation. We said that it was main topic of interests in the field of translation studies, and there have been vast amount of studies conducted in this field. And as a whole, when you read the book, when you handle the book, the translation as a whole, it gives the same chaotic effect of the original, but it lacks the stylistic features of the target text. Now here you can see my references, and this was all from me. Thank you for listening.